Mr. Utzon, your opening statement, if you would, please.
Great. And I also extend my thanks to the committee for having me today. I present to you today on behalf of the London Homeless Coalition and the London Community Advocates Network. However, my comments also draw heavily on my experience working frontline as a nurse with people experiencing homelessness at the London Intercommunity Health Centre, and on my current position as an assistant professor in the Arthur Labatt Family School of Nursing, where my research and teaching focus on the intersections of poverty, housing, and health. There are two brief pictures I hope to paint for you, and to, in some small way, bring the realities as the other witnesses have of Canadian citizens experiencing homelessness. So these are obtaining identification, and then a picture of what happens on a typical election day in London, Ontario. Maintaining and obtaining identification is one of the key challenges faced by people experiencing homelessness in terms of barriers to exiting homelessness and exiting poverty in general. Both qualitative and quantitative research studies have continually highlighted the rapid decline of possessing current and accurate identification starting from the date of first homelessness. So that is to say, the longer one is homeless, the exponentially less likely one is to have current and accurate identification. This particularly impacts those living with a mental health challenge, as well as women fleeing domestic violence. How is identification lost? Unfortunately, as others have said, it's frequently stolen along with one's personal possessions, and it's also lost in the chaos of people's lives. At times, it's left behind if a person is unable to return to a shelter where their belongings are temporarily stored, or if women fleeing violence are unable to go back and access their possessions. Once identification is lost, as has been mentioned, the process to replace it is laborious, it's expensive, and it's long. Individuals often have to start right back at connecting with their community of birth to obtain a birth certificate, then wait 4 to 8 weeks for this to come in before accessing the next piece of identification. This process is also a challenge, as one requires a permanent address throughout the process of where that ID is going to come to. Fortunately, many agencies that serve people who are homeless are used to and well equipped to serve as a permanent or temporarily permanent address. Unfortunately, due again to the chaos of people's lives, the process of replacing lost identification is often interrupted. So many times, pieces of ID that are ordered then end up sitting unclaimed as the person enters a new cycle of distress. Therefore, on any given day, a significant amount of people experiencing homelessness in Canada find themselves without identification. This is a challenge, but historically in London, we've been able to rise to that challenge. Health and social service agencies in London mobilize every election day to ensure as much as possible that citizens who want to vote are able to, in spite of their housing status and identification challenges. This community-wide mobilization focuses firstly on ensuring that individuals are using an agency for their permanent address and are thus able to obtain the voter ID card. For those who have not received that, or it's gone to a different place, the next level of mobilization is with the provisions under 143.3 of the Elections Act, known colloquially as the vouching system. As you're aware, under this section of the Act, those with proper identification are able to vouch for another citizen within their polling area. So workers across health and social service agencies are made aware of these provisions. That's part of what we do, is first make sure that the homeless serving agencies know how it works. And people self-identify who live within polling areas where many people who are homeless are located. And when a person experiencing homelessness but without identification enters an agency, expresses an interest in voting, often the agencies have a sign that says, "Ask us how you can vote." They're connected with someone who can vouch for them, whether it's someone who works in the agency, another person who's homeless who's also said that they would like to go and vote, and that they will be accompanied then with someone who can vouch for them at the polling station. This is made simpler in our community because one or more of the serving agencies usually are a polling station, so that just makes it, in terms of the walking part of it, a little easier for everyone. This gives you a bit of a picture of what we do, and to this statement I would like to add a bit of a clarification on the letter of attestation, because this is something that, unlike the previous witnesses, we do use quite frequently within London. Unfortunately, the wording is that the person ordinarily resides and receives services at such and such an agency, so That works well for some people. So if people have been in a shelter for a while, then that works. For others, though, whether they're sleeping rough, whether they're transient from city to city, whether they're couch surfing and their address is changing, or whether they're recently admitted into social housing, so their housing status is changing, that doesn't work. So unfortunately, although we do use the letter of attestation quite a bit, it still leaves a big gap, which is where the vouching fills in. So under Bill C-23, the provisions of 143.3 are removed. This will present a very real challenge to people experiencing homelessness across Canada and disenfranchise them from a significant part of the democratic process. Unfortunately, full identification replacement is simply not achievable on time in most cases. As hard as we try, it just often isn't there on time. And they do try their best, the agencies. So this means that if Bill C-23 proceeds as written, a particular subset of the population will be adversely impacted. And in any policy analysis, when a particular subset is affected, that is a red flag. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're moving well on time, so I'll go to Mr. Reid for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Orchin, if I could. You were just talking about the attestation forms and your use of them. I gather that if someone goes in to vote with an attestation form, they also require another piece of identification. That the form on its own is not sufficient. Is that correct?
I would have to defer to a social worker to answer that question.
Okay. Actually, the reason I asked that was I'm basing it on what the Chief Electoral Officer puts out on his website about what you have to have. He says, an original document with name and address is required, but it's in a category that says show 2 pieces of authorized identification. Both pieces must have your name and one must have your address. So I gather this is one of the 2 and it's the one with the address.
Right.
The reason I asked that was I was wondering if that piece of identification, if we're treated as a unique piece of identification, one that would serve on its own, would it be helpful? But I gather you're not actually able to answer that question.
Well, the one thing I do know from my colleagues who do the direct service, the social workers, is that it's that ordinarily reside and receive services from, that's the bigger issue. So whether they do give out the letters of attestation as people request them, but they can only if they are able. So if someone, for example, is coming to the Intercommunity Health Center, which provides a lot of the services, they don't necessarily know where that person ordinarily resides. So it would be dependent upon a shelter. That shelter, the person may have just come in that night. Or it could be a shelter that provides just a nightly, like a managed alcohol drop-in or recovery situation where people come and go. So again, it's the ordinarily reside that becomes an issue. That letter is helpful for some, but not all.
Yeah. Okay, I was about to interrupt you. I actually hate when people do it, so I'm glad you finished because now I don't have to interrupt you. Wouldn't that be a problem with vouching anyway? I mean, if the person is, in a sense, in flux as to where they reside that very day, then finding someone from the same who resides in the same poll to vouch for them becomes an issue, I would think, anyway.
Well, so it's different then because if, again, so say I'm the nurse at a health center and someone walks in who I know. I've seen them. I know their name. It matches up with their file in terms of providing services. And they happen to live in the poll that I live in. Then that is a requirement that is met. And so I think what you'll see in these situations is that each part of the system, whether it's the vouching, the letter of attestation, has a bit of a different scenario for the individual, and the current suite of options provides the most ability for everyone to vote.
As you can see, one of the things we're trying to do is figure out whether the letter of attestation can be adjusted to be more useful. So I don't know if you know the answer to this question. If you don't, I'll keep on asking you, but if you don't, I'll turn to one of the other witnesses. Does Elections Canada provide a standard blank form?
Yes.
So they do have one. That's what you use.
Yeah. We just print them off, and it has a section for the individual to fill out, and then a section for the service agency provider to fill out.
Right, and they keep some kind of list then of the authorized signatures of people who have worked at the shelters. Is that how it operates?
That's a detail I would not know.
Okay. Well, maybe I can ask, if you don't mind, if I could ask Ms. Mulholland then. You had said, actually wrote down your quote, "We've offered the use of attestation forms to vouch for persons who have no ID." I wanted to ask about something in that quote, but first I'll just ask the forms you're using. I guess the question I was asking Mr. Orchin, do you know the answer to that?
Yes, the forms that we've used have been provided by Elections Canada, and the way that we've been instructed to use them through our member agency is that the address on those forms would be the address of the agency for people that are of no fixed address. And so that's how we've been able to identify that, one, that we know the person, and that this is their address, and that fits within that catchment.
Yeah. So it's you don't actually know their address in the sense that they are of no fixed address, but essentially you know they're pretty local. They're likely to be within that hole or a couple of holes, that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay, that's helpful.
Yes, Burnaby. Sorry, I was just going to say Burnaby is very large geographically. There are lots of parks. A number of our homeless folks live in camps in the parks, so it would be impossible to identify an address other than the agency.
Okay, got that. The way you phrased it, I just want to ask that we have offered the use of attestation forms to vouch for persons who have no ID. I assume you didn't mean that literally, because attestation forms are one thing, and vouching is a separate thing. You can, I assume, issue an attestation form to a number of different people. You don't have to live in the same hole, but you must be someone who's in a responsible position at a soup kitchen or a shelter or one of a limited number of agencies. So those are actually two separate things you were talking about, I assume. Is that right?
Yes, and the person who has filled out those forms has been the supervisor of the Homeless Outreach Program exclusively.
All right, that's helpful to me. I wanted to ask about Mr. Allen, if I could. You'd mentioned how you have people vouch for individuals to use to enter and establish an account at Pigeon Park Savings. I'm assuming that this is not quite the same as the vouching used by Elections Canada. I could be wrong; might be exactly the same. But I'm guessing that in fact the individual who is doing the vouching is effectively doing something more like the attestation. Would that be true, or am I wrong?
Well, I mean, it's a case-by-case basis, but I have personally opened accounts where there's a person moves into a new housing project, and there's a neighbor that's had an account with us for a while, similar to a voter who's voted for a while and is already on the voters list, and they say, yeah, he doesn't have ID right now, but he needs to open an account. I could vouch for him, and I do open that account, and we haven't experienced any fraud as a result of that practice, and it's that accessibility has meant a great deal to a lot of people in the neighborhood.
Well, I can imagine. They're putting money in, though, I assume. They don't come in and say, I'll vote for someone, he can now take money out. I'm guessing that's the case. Is that right?
Well, no, there's no money in the account. There's no money in the account until they put money in, of course.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay, I'm actually not sure how much I can pursue that because I'm still having some trouble getting the mental picture. But the other thing I want to ask, just very, very quick, do I have any time left?
You have zero time left.
All right, I won't get to ask that question.
Well, not,
but anyway, thank you very much.
Overall, but just in that round. We'll go to Madame Latendresse for 7 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Puis je veux commencer par...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank our witnesses, especially for the work you do in general, because I think that you're going to help the most underprivileged in our society. If there weren't people like you doing that, those people would have absolutely nothing. So thank you very much for that. What we're doing right now, when we look at the changes that will be brought about to the Elections Act, one of the main problems is the fact that people can no longer use the voter information card or someone to vouch for them. It's not that many people use those systems. We know the vast majority of Canadians have, for instance, a driver's license, and that's enough to vote. But those two measures were the safety net to make sure that everyone, all Canadian citizens, could have the right to vote. That's a fundamental right under our Constitution. And I think the people you represent here are those we're talking about when we say those who are forgotten by society, but they still have the right to vote. So both the vouching system and the voter information card use allowed us to be sure that nobody was left by the wayside. I have figures here. Depending on the way you count these things, apparently between 300,000 and 900,000 people are considered homeless or without a fixed address. I find that number very high. I wouldn't have thought it was that high, but people like you then have to try to do something to provide the necessary documentation to allow these people to vote. What you do is fantastic, but putting all that responsibility on shelters and soup kitchens for providing that documentation, in my opinion, that's an enormous burden on organizations with limited resources at the outset and who don't have a lot of time and energy for this. So could I get your comments on that and see what you have to say about it? We could start by Madam Mulholland, if you wish.
We're committed to assisting the people that are in need, and there has never been any concern on our part about the time that it takes, because our priority is to provide an opportunity for people to vote if they wish. The idea that this might be removed is of great concern to us.
Yeah, and I could add to that. I mean, I hear like it is some days working in the neighborhood, it's really hectic. Like there's a lot of things going on, and for individuals who are, if we're wanting to on election day help someone to vote, people who are disabled, in wheelchairs, have trouble with mobility issues, to find the individual in their poll, to walk with them, to allow them to be the voucher for that individual, to organize all of that takes a lot out of the day, but that's the only opportunity that person would have to vote. So I mean, all of these things are good. The application forms are good. What all of the political parties do in terms of trying to make sure their own supporters have credentials ahead of election day is a good thing that happens. But for folks who are exceptionally marginalized, without that other mechanism that allows someone to vouch for them, it's effectively they do not have the right to vote. But I appreciate what you say. I mean, we're happy to try and enfranchise as many people as possible, but it is a lot of work, and we wish we had more individuals to help people vote. We would probably increase the homeless vote as a result, but we can only do so much on election day, and we go flat out. The people I work with who attempt to help people in any way they can, whether it be with transportation or help finding credentials or through finding an individual to vouch for people, we go 8 till 8, and we're always disappointed that we haven't got to everybody, and we never will get to everybody.
Might highlight that these agencies have limited budgets, and they have a lot of important decisions that they have to make in use of those budgets. And ultimately, all of the homeless serving agencies want to end homelessness, which means providing people safe, secure, permanent, and affordable housing. However, they provide other services along the way, and many will have actually an ID fund, which will fund part of the replacement fees, for example, of this identification. The more time, energy, and resources that go into identification, the less time, energy, and resources we have to truly end homeless, which is providing people with the housing supports that they need.
Merci. T'avais-tu une question? Je vais laisser le reste de mon temps à mon collègue Scott.
Oh, sure. I'd like to pick up a little, if I could, on the voter information card. The government gets very upset when we say voter identification card, because that's what we think it should be. You've got a lot of experience with that. I even heard, it may have been the previous panel, forgive me if that's the case, but someone gave testimony and said the amount of, I think it was one of you that talked about the amount of work it takes to get the voter identification card, because that, with vouching, could get you a ballot and you'd be allowed to vote. The Chief Electoral Officer is allowed to designate whatever ID, except the law is now going to prohibit the voter identification card from being used as a piece of ID. How is that going to impact on the people you're trying to help on election day? The fact that those voter identification cards, if they've gone through all the hoops of getting them and they're lucky enough to have it, isn't even going to be ID at the polling station. How many Canadians stand to be turned away because this document won't be recognized as ID, in your view?
Anyone
I can say that's almost the most depressing thing, because you're talking about someone who went out of their way ready to register to vote, or if they voted in the past, they're an active Canadian citizen. For whatever reason, they don't have identification on election day, and in the past they likely, a lot of people will assume that card will allow them to vote, and it'll just be the most depressing situation where someone takes that time, goes to vote, and then something that allowed them to vote in the past no longer allows them to vote. It would be it's depressing if that. I don't want to see that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Staffen. Quick answer, sure.
I'll just paint a picture of individuals who we see this with often. Might be some who do maintain some kind of permanent address. So we see this, for example, people in cyclical experiences of poverty, where there may be a familial home, but they themselves are experiencing homelessness. They've lost all their identification and are able to come and go from the familial home at times, and to retain or obtain that voter ID card. And I would say, so it's a significant portion of people experiencing both homelessness but also poverty in general, who will be unable to vote because of being unable to use that card.
They said they wanted lots of people to vote, and we're here, and they're not going to be able to.
Mr. Sims, 7 minutes for you, please.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us from British Columbia as well. I want to go to Mr. Allen first, because I was very taken back by what you had said about how it works at the Pigeon Park Savings. And I'm going to quote from what you said. We open accounts for people without identification. Like in the Elections Act, we rely on vouching. We rely on vouching from neighbors, financial assistance workers, housing providers, clinical workers, including doctors and nurses, etc. This is where it's very important. In over 10 years of operations, now having opened accounts for more than 10,000 unique individuals, we have never had one case of fraud as a result of a falsified identity. Mr. Allen, that's a pretty strong statement. And we're talking about banking. We're not talking about a constitutional right, which is Section 3 of our charter, when we talk about voting. Our previous witnesses talk about they didn't really see an incentive to commit fraud. But for some reason in this debate that we're having here, there's always this nefarious assumption that is tagged along with vouching. Like it's something that we should be suspicious of, as opposed to encouraging people to vote. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if someone is similar to, as I was saying before, if someone has an account with us, and we know their account history, similar to if someone's on the voters list, I believe that is enough trust for me to allow an account to open, and for that person to deposit checks, to deposit cash, to have money transfers go into the account, and then to receive an ATM card and continue to have financial services. We had to have this rule at Pigeon Park Savings Bank, because otherwise we wouldn't have any account holders. Initially, almost all of our accounts come from people who are very disenfranchised, homeless individuals who have experienced financial exclusion from other institutions, which have very strict identification requirements of having current ID required, similar to what the rules would be if Bill C-23 is able to pass. So, it's thousands of people that we have files on, and we do what we can to help people find identification. But as was mentioned by the other panelists, that it does take a lot of effort to find someone's birth certificate, find someone's SIN card, find the money required to buy a voter identification card, or a BC identification card. So for people with mental health issues, it's very challenging to have the patience to do that. As you can imagine, people with addiction issues have other concerns as well. It could be argued that some folks I don't want to argue that some folks don't deserve the right to vote. I think someone who's a mentally ill, drug addict, who's homeless, still deserves the right to vote, even if some people don't think that they're deserving of anything. I believe that they can and should participate in the democratic process. And when, without much conversation, saying what's at stake in some elections, people are very mobilized around things, and to deny them that franchise is, I find it depressing, but it's a great injustice when you see it in a systematic level where working the downtown east side, it's a high concentration of poor people. So already I think the rules are very restrictive for people there's a lot of hoops to jump through in order to vote. To deny even the hoop to jump through to vote is it's a tragedy.
Because this is disenfranchising on a major scale to you. This is going to be a real noticeable difference in this next election if this legislation is carried through in its current form. Correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Mr. Uchorn, I'm going to ask you to comment on what I just asked about then, about vouching, but something else that you said that actually caught my attention, a big gap with the attestation. And we have heard a lot about this attestation is going to be the cure for all the ills when it comes to, not all of them, but most of them, when it comes to vouching. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate more on that big gap you're talking about?
Sure. When you look at the terminology ordinarily reside, and you look at the definition of homelessness, those two don't usually go hand in hand. Because of the services we're able to provide with shelters, for some that works. But for the majority, they're homeless because they have lost the place where they ordinarily reside.
Sorry, Ms. Mulholland, I didn't mean to exclude you. Did you have any comment on what's been?
Just if I could add that the idea of people being excluded from voting in their own country because of poverty and the complications that are connected with that is very discouraging, and it does a disservice to everyone I work with.
Thank you very much.
You have a minute and a half, Mr. Sims.
Oh, goodness.
There's others who would
the
take
generosity
it.
knows no boundaries. Yeah. I want to, one of the issues we haven't discussed too much in this conversation is about, we're now restricting Elections Canada only to provide the perfunctory information about where to vote, when to vote, which is fine. But the role in enticing people, inspiring people to vote, to communicate, and to gather information will be hindered. Is that something that concerns you as well, Mr. Uchorn? You want to try that first?
Yeah, obviously people need to be aware of what's going on. I think one of the things that stands to be mentioned, though, to this committee is that, in my experience, people experiencing homelessness are quite aware. So one of the things that we do see is very high uptake of consumption of local news. So you see lots of access to newspapers in soup kitchens and shelters. And so I would suggest that people experiencing homelessness are actually quite political, quite informed. These issues are very pertinent to them. It's their livelihood that is often at hand when we compare different policies from different parties. I believe, obviously, the advertisement around elections is an important piece, but perhaps not for the population that I'm most familiar with.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. We'll go to Mr. O'Toole. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your work and for your appearance here. The issue here, really, I would suggest, is voter participation. And Election Canada, in a 2007 study, identified homelessness as one of the areas where there's a significant barrier they described it as one of 3 groups of persons with special needs impacting voter participation. And what you're saying and what our previous witnesses, including the quote, "so much is going on," turnout is extremely low. But we've also heard from expert witnesses in both Canada and the U.S. that have said voter participation has very little to do with identification or administration barriers and more with a variety of socioeconomic and other aspects. Mr. Sims said there's a nefarious assumption associated with vouching. The Neufeld report from Elections Canada said that 46 to 80% of vouching transactions have errors or are done incorrectly. And finally, Mr. Udshorn and Mr. Allen both have talked about how challenging it is to work within vouching. Mr. Allen, you said it takes a lot of the day. Mr. Udsmanson said when a person experiencing homelessness but without identification enters an agency and expressed an interest in voting, they are connected with someone who can vouch for them. So this connecting people with vouchers, as Mr. Reid said, seems extremely difficult, much more than an enormous burden of doing an attestation. So my question would be this, and I've heard here that the concerns about using attestations and whether one is ordinarily residing within a polling area. If Elections Canada were to simplify a one-page attestation and make it much more simple for someone to qualify as ordinarily resident, even if they haven't been seen in the shelter in some time, would it not be easier for groups like yours on the front lines, rather than matching vouchers on election day with T-shirts, to use these simplified attestations to encourage more participation? I'd like your thoughts on that, please.
I would agree. Vouching process is more effort than the letter of attestation. Currently, it fills in a gap when the letter of attestation doesn't work. So when someone comes in, we say we can't provide that, so we can work with the vouching. A change to the letter of attestation would make it easier. So for example, if all that was required was this person receives services regularly, rather than ordinarily resides, then that would definitely make the letter of attestation easier to use. But in the current structure, with the letter of attestation not working for everyone, then the vouching does definitely fill in for that.
Because my colleague, Ms. Latendresse, said that it's an enormous burden using the attestations, but if we simplify it, what I'm getting from you is that it could actually be easier, less of a burden than pairing up vouching people.
I would highlight it is just a one-pager right now. So it is, the form itself is fairly simple. It's just, who am I? Where do I work? Who is this person? Where do they ordinarily reside and receive services? It would require a change of the language to make it more effective.
Mr. Allen, Ms. Mulholland, any thoughts on if we simplified this, would it make it easier to raise participation rates?
I think doing anything to increase participation rates is a good thing. I don't think it's either or, though. I don't know why it needs to be exclusive where we do vouching or we do attestation. Having both in place is probably for the best.
Well, if I can speak to that, I think participation...
You had more time, but you don't. So we're going to move on to Mr. Scott for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess what I would say is to Mr. O'Toole's questions, if he and the government side were willing to engage a discussion in redefining what address means in the Act, so that that letter of attestation to people who are only receiving services and can't in a reasonable sense be said to reside there, sure, why not? Let's do that. And at the same time, as Mr. Allen has said, why not keep vouching as the final safety net? And not get rid of the voter information cards, because they do come from a intersection of databases that have not shown to be liable to produce fraud. I'd like to just compliment Professor Udshorn and his colleagues in London for what you do. The description of citizens helping citizens in the way you do it is absolutely inspiring, and I guess all I would do is echo Madame Latendresse Alexandrine's comments that the idea of adding extra burdens by getting rid of vouching without anything that would be a sure replacement just does not make sense. And when Mr. Allen used another amazing metaphor, that you said there's already lots of hoops to jump through, taking the hoop away is just too much to accept. And I thought that was an amazingly accurate and poignant image, so thank you for that. I did want to ask just a little bit more, because Mr. Reid started us on this, and he asked some very good questions on the bank account opening. I just wanted to point out an irony that's, at some level, vouching to open a bank account, leading you to the statement that in 10,000 or so cases, no instance of fraud as a result that you know of. In the end, you're a bank. Presumably, if paper forms of the bank statement were available, that could turn into proof of address within the current system. If you have a second piece of ID, which people may not. So why not allow vouching in the first place if that which produces a valid address in the system is vouching? It just strikes me that we're going around in circles. We're not trusting people. And the example you've brought to the table just shows if we trust people, why? Where's the evidence? Do you see any evidence that people are more likely to commit fraud on voting day than they did in the case of opening bank accounts with you?
Well, and you said that I know of, I do know that we haven't. As manager, I know that there has not been any case of falsified identification. I can imagine that if someone steals someone's check out of a mailbox and wants to get someone to vouch for them and open an account and cash a check, but that doesn't happen. The fact that we have an account holder vouch for someone else, similar to someone on the voters list vouch for someone else. That simple qualification has has allowed thousands of people to achieve a bank account, or in the case of an election, thousands of people to vote. And I've never experienced a single case of false ID ever. 10 years that we've been working in the neighborhood.
Thank you. And Ms. Mulholland, would you like to add anything at all? I think I only have about 30 seconds.
I would just like to add that it is about trusting people and providing mechanisms for people to participate. It's also about recognizing that people shouldn't be punished because of poverty. And it's because of poverty that there are the issues around identification, and that the two of those things together in a society that is democratic is crucial to be supportive of all of our citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. We'll go to Mr. O'Toole for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to continue on my last line of questioning because I think it's important, and I would refer any of you to the electoral participation of persons with special needs report from Elections Canada in 2007, and that identifies areas of recommendations, including mobile polls, including assistance. And many Canadians may not realize, but electoral reforms in 2000 actually provided that shelters could be used to satisfy the residency provisions. Before that, that didn't exist. And Ms. Barr, who was here before from Raise the Roof, was one of several participants in roundtables with Elections Canada, perhaps yourself were as well. And that led to our famous list of 39 pieces of identification, which the attestation letter is one of those. So thank you. Some of you might have participated like Ms. Barr did. But it's important for us to separate the challenges with vouching from voter participation. So vouching is an identification vouching happens when there is no identification. And Mr. Neufeld's study from the 2011 election and some by-elections, including my own, showed that not only was there trouble administering it, but it led to a huge error rate, 46% serious errors, which in the opinion of courts could overturn a result. My suggestion would be that the vouching errors that we're trying to eliminate here doesn't get to the participation, voter participation challenges facing the homeless. And Ms. Mulholland, you said poverty should not be a barrier. In this instance, along the lines of what I was saying with the attestation before, since 2000 to the attestation now, have you seen an increase amongst people using the shelters since the reforms in 2000? Have you seen more voter participation?
In Burnaby, we do not have any shelters, so we're not able to participate in the way that other municipalities can.
Any other thoughts on have you seen the changes in 2000 through to the attestation? Has that led to increased voter turnout amongst homeless or folks in shelter?
I don't have the stats available on that, but one of the things I would highlight, because I know that came right from the homeless serving sector to do that letter of attestation, and it was before my time. I had more hair, less degrees, and wasn't in the sector yet. But it was done in the context of also having the vouching, right? So putting in that additional opportunity for identification still had that other opportunity as well. And so when that was recommended, it wasn't recommended in the context of no vouching alternative.
So in your experience with the vouching, and you described the challenge connecting people,
Yeah.
only one person, so yourself, for instance, could only vouch for one other person.
Yep.
How do you find not the people that need the vouching, but the people that can provide it? How do you identify those people?
Yeah, so part of it is just making everyone aware it's elections day. So those signs, like I said, ask me how to vote, help people be aware of that. So that starting with all the service providers know that that's going on and that the vouching is an option for them. And then the second is having people maybe go together. So if you're at a service agency that is not a polling station and there's 3 or 4 people that have said they want to vote, some of them have ID, some don't, they know each other, they've lived in shelter together, then people can vote together.
Wouldn't it be easier for your volunteers to have a pile of the attestations to just use when they recognize someone?
If that was available, but again, it goes back to the wording of the attestation that you couldn't just hand out an attestation to whoever came through.
If you recognize them as having been in the shelter, you could?
If you can attest that they've ordinarily resided, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to thank all of our witnesses, and thank you, Professor Utzharm, Ms. Mulholland, Mr. Allen. Thank you for sharing with us tonight. Thank you for the work you do, too. And thank you for being able to come tonight and help us out with this. We are adjourned.